My investigation confronts a fundamental misalignment between two distinct records of the past, the material and the textual. When I examine the physical evidence for a catastrophic event, I find one type of pattern. When I analyze the written traditions describing that same event, a very different structure emerges. The central problem is not a simple contradiction of facts. It is a conflict in function. The geological and archaeological data point toward a significant yet survivable disruption. The literary records, however, frame this event as an absolute historical rupture, a clean break in the timeline. This forces a critical shift in my analytical approach. The primary question is no longer about verifying the physical reality of a great flood. Instead, I must investigate why the scribal memory of this event was constructed to serve as a categorical dividing line in history. What emerges is a tension between an event and its narrative. The textual tradition appears to use the flood as a powerful organizational tool, separating a mythic, primordial era from a more recent, political one. This suggests the narrative has a purpose beyond simple historical recording. My analysis, therefore, must focus on this functional gap. I need to determine the purpose of this textual reorganization. The objective is to understand not what happened, but why it was remembered and recorded in such a highly structured and transformative way. Archaeological data from the ancient site of Shuruppak points to a significant alluvial deposit. When I examine the stratigraphy, I see this thick layer of clay and silt clearly interrupts the city's established occupational sequence, sealing the layers below it. This interruption is not a minor detail. In archaeological terms, a clean break in a settlement's layers suggests a powerful event, one severe enough to halt daily life and bury the existing urban landscape under a sterile deposit. It represents a sudden, physical rupture. The evidence from Shuruppak, however, does not stand alone. A similar sedimentary layer is identified at the site of Kish, located a considerable distance away. This finding is critical because it introduces a crucial geographical dimension to the physical evidence. Finding this layer at both Kish and Shuruppak forces a reconsideration of scale. What could have been interpreted as a localized river flood now points toward a much more widespread phenomenon, one that appears to have affected multiple independent urban centers across southern Mesopotamia. To ground this event in time, I turn to radiocarbon dating of organic material found within these flood strata. The results consistently place this depositional event around 2900 BCE. This provides a concrete chronological marker for my investigation. Having a date like 2900 BCE is methodologically essential. It allows me to anchor the geological event to a specific historical moment, the early dynastic period of Sumer. This creates a fixed point against which other forms of evidence, particularly textual records, can be measured. Taken together, these two elements, the widespread physical strata and the specific chronological anchor, form the material basis for this inquiry. This is not a mythic event in an undefined past. It appears to be a geological horizon with a date and a location. This physical evidence, however, is only one half of the equation. It functions as my control variable for this analysis. The central question now becomes how this verifiable, yet apparently survivable disruption was recorded and remembered by the scribal cultures that followed. With the material evidence anchored around 2900 BCE, I now turn to the documentary record. My primary source for this stage is the Sumerian king list, a text that provides a systematic, though highly stylized chronicle of rulers and their cities. To corroborate the king list, I must also examine other key Mesopotamian texts. The Epic of Gilgamesh, particularly its 11th tablet, and the Atra-Hassis epic both contain detailed flood narratives that offer a different, more mythological perspective on the same event. When I analyze these records collectively, a clear structural principle emerges. They consistently organize the pre-flood period as a distinct historical sequence, complete with its own internal logic and a unique set of characteristics that set it apart from the era that follows. This antediluvian era is defined by a specific roster of cities, such as Eridu and Bad Tibera, which are said to have held kingship before the deluge. The rulers of these cities are credited with reigns of extraordinary, even impossible, length. The Sumerian king list makes this division explicit. It lists a sequence of 8 kings across 5 cities and then inserts a stark pivotal line, Then the flood swept over. This textual marker functions as an absolute caesura in the historical account. Examining the entries before this break, I find rulers like Alulim of Eridu, said to have reigned for 28,800 years, and En-men-Luana of Bad Tibira, with a reign of 43,200 years. These figures operate on a completely different chronological scale than any known historical king. In contrast, when I look at the section immediately following the flood, the text states that kingship descended from heaven again, this time to the city of Kish. While still long, the reigns of post-flood rulers like Etana of Kish are drastically shorter, suggesting a shift in the very nature of timekeeping. The Atrahasis epic provides a narrative context for this break. It frames the flood not as a random natural disaster, but as a deliberate act by the gods to control a noisy and overpopulated humanity. This adds a layer of theological justification to the historical rupture. Within the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood story is recounted by a survivor, Utnapishtim, a figure who achieved immortality. His testimony is presented as a piece of secret, ancient knowledge, a memory preserved from a world that was otherwise completely destroyed. What I am faced with, then, is a collection of textual data that is highly organized. My initial survey of these documents does not reveal a simple memory of a large flood. Instead, it reveals a consistently applied narrative structure that uses the flood to partition the past into two fundamentally different epochs. When I place the physical evidence alongside the textual records, a critical alignment becomes visible. The 2900 BCE flood strata from sites like Shuruppak and Kish appear to correspond directly with the sharp narrative break described in the Sumerian king list. This is a pivotal moment in my analysis. The rupture in the earth and the rupture on the cuneiform tablet seem to be referencing the same horizon. The central investigative question, then, is to determine the precise nature of this relationship. What emerges from this comparison is a systemic pattern. Across all the key literary sources, the flood is not merely an event within a sequence. It functions as the central fulcrum upon which the entire timeline of history is balanced. This structure consistently and methodically separates everything that came before from everything that came after. It is a clean, absolute division that appears in the king list, is given theological weight in Atrahasis, and is preserved as ancient wisdom in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The result is the creation of two distinct and irreconcilable epochs, a pre-Diluvian age and a post-Diluvian age. Each of these eras is defined by its own unique characteristics, its own set of cities, and its own internal logic of time and power. I observe that the pre-Diluvian timeline is characterized by a greatly expanded, almost mythical temporal scale. The reigns of the 8 kings listed before the flood, such as En-men-Luana of Bad Tibira, are measured in tens of thousands of years. In stark contrast, the post-Diluvian chronology, beginning with the dynasty of Kish, operates on a compressed and more recognizably human scale. This is not a gradual change. It is an abrupt shift in the very fabric of recorded time, occurring precisely at the flood marker. This systematic separation forces a methodological reconsideration. A simple chaotic memory of a natural disaster would not likely produce such a highly ordered and symmetrical historical structure. The pattern appears too deliberate, too clean. The consistency of this division across different texts suggests this is not an accident of transmission. Instead, it points toward a conscious and sophisticated organization of collective memory by the scribal class. This leads me to a primary hypothesis for this stage of the investigation. The flood narrative seems to function less as a literal transcription of a past event and more as a powerful intellectual tool used to structure and categorize the deep past. Here, however, the very neatness of the pattern I've identified becomes a source of analytical friction. The textual structure is almost too perfect, too symmetrical. Real historical memory, especially of a traumatic event, is rarely so cleanly organized. This suggests I am not looking at a simple record, but at a highly refined intellectual construct. What I observe is that the flood narrative functions to separate two fundamentally different systems of recounting the past. The pre-flood system operates on a mythic timeline, where kingship is a divine concept and rulers have a direct, almost familial relationship with the gods. The post-flood system, in contrast, inaugurates a political timeline. Kingship becomes a prize to be won, passing from city to city, from Kish to Uruk to Ur. This part of the record aligns much more closely with the verifiable chronologies and archaeological data from the early dynastic period. The textual function of the flood, then, is to serve as a firewall between these two distinct modes of conceiving the past. It is not just an event, it is the mechanism that transitions the world from a mythological state to a political one. At this point, a severe methodological problem emerges. When I place the archaeological data back into this framework, a significant misalignment appears. The material evidence from sites like Shuruppak and Kish does not support the idea of a total societal collapse and restart. The textual rupture is not mirrored by a complete cultural rupture in the ground. While the 2900 BCE flood layer is a clear and disruptive horizon, the material culture of the period that follows, the pottery styles, the architectural forms, the administrative technology like cylinder seals, demonstrates a strong degree of continuity with what came before it. This is a critical finding. It suggests that while the flood was a significant catastrophe, it was a survivable one. Sumerian civilization was disrupted, but it was not erased and recreated from scratch. The society that rebuilt was recognizably the same one that had been inundated. I am therefore confronted with a fundamental conflict between my two primary data sets. The literary tradition insists on an absolute break, a world wiped clean. The archaeological record, my control variable, points toward disruption followed by cultural and social resilience. This discrepancy forces a crucial shift in my investigative hypothesis. If the narrative of total destruction does not reflect the physical reality, then it must be performing a different kind of work. Its purpose appears to be ideological, not historical. The sharp textual break may have served a vital political function. For the new dynasties that rose to prominence in cities like Kish after the 2900 BCE event, this narrative provided a powerful tool of legitimization. It framed their rule not as a continuation, but as a brand new beginning sanctioned by the gods. To test this, I can compare the earlier Sumerian versions of the flood story with later Akkadian recensions. When I do this, I observe subtle but important shifts in emphasis and detail. This points to an adaptive textual tradition, one that was modified over time to meet the needs of new political realities. This textual fluidity further undermines the idea of a static, literal memory of the flood. Instead, it suggests the narrative was a living political instrument, a story that was deliberately reshaped to explain, justify, and structure the world for the rulers who commissioned the scribes. This misalignment between the material and textual records forces a fundamental shift in my entire investigative approach. The central question is no longer about verifying the physical event of the flood. Instead, I must analyze the function of its narrative. What does this story do? The stark division in the Sumerian king list appears to be a powerful mechanism for political legitimization. For the new dynasties that emerged in cities like Kish after the 2900 BCE disruption, this narrative offered a clean slate, a year zero for their authority. By framing their rule as the beginning of a new, post-Diluvian world order, these kings were not merely continuing an older tradition, they were presented as the founders of history itself, their power divinely sanctioned in a world remade by the gods. This is a potent ideological claim. Beyond legitimization, the flood narrative could also serve to redefine royal genealogies. It provides a way to sever all ties to a prior political order, effectively erasing the claims of any rival lineages that might trace their ancestry to the powerful antediluvian kings of Eridu or Bad Tibira. What I may be looking at is a deliberate act of scribal engineering. The flood story acts as a genealogical firewall, protecting the new political landscape of the early dynastic period from the inconvenient claims of a mythic and perhaps competing past. This forces me to reconsider the very nature of the knowledge being transmitted. The revelation contained in these texts is not about recovering a lost pre-flood history. The true revelation is in observing the sophisticated scribal construction of the past itself. The story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, then, is not simply a memory of a survivor. It is a literary device that frames this constructed history as ancient sacred wisdom, giving it an authority that a simple king list might lack. What emerges is a dynamic process, a real catastrophic event, the 2900 BCE flood, appears to have been harnessed and transformed into a foundational myth. Its purpose was to structure a new political reality and justify the distribution of power within it. My analysis must therefore move beyond a simple comparison of geology and text. I am now investigating the intellectual technology of the scribal class, how they used narrative to shape reality, manage memory, and engineer the consent of the governed. The investigation now centers on this interplay of historical rupture, selective preservation, and the functional reinterpretation of memory. The next step is to dissect the mechanisms of this textual production and understand the political context in which it was created. This brings my investigation back to its starting point, the Sumerian king list. I am no longer looking at it as a flawed chronicle of the past. Instead, it now appears to be a highly sophisticated political instrument, a technology for structuring reality itself. The initial problem of a flood is therefore displaced. The central question is no longer about a single event, but about the cognitive power of a catastrophe narrative. Why is a world-ending deluge such an effective tool for reorganizing collective memory and political authority? This forces me to ask a more fundamental question about scribal intention. Were the authors of these texts consciously creating propaganda, or were they operating within a worldview where mythic narratives were the only logical way to explain and legitimize political change? What I am confronting appears to be a different form of historical consciousness. It is one where the past is not a continuous line of events to be recorded, but a set of distinct categories, mythic, political, local, that must be carefully managed and separated by conceptual firewalls. The flood narrative functions as the most powerful of these firewalls. This pattern, however, may not be unique to Mesopotamia. It raises the possibility that the use of a founding cataclysm is a recurring strategy in the formation of early states, a tool for manufacturing a clean origin point. This suggests the king list is not just a record, but a charter myth in textual form. It doesn't describe the world as it was. It provides a blueprint for how the world and the power within it ought to be understood in the wake of a profound societal disruption. My focus must therefore shift from the content of the flood story to the underlying logic of its application. The next stage of this inquiry cannot be about what the scribes wrote, but about how they thought, how they used narrative to build and maintain a political cosmos. To understand this, I must now examine the medium itself. The analysis must move beyond the story and into the very structure of cuneiform writing as a technology for imposing order on time, memory, and power. The tablet itself becomes the primary artifact of my investigation.